A quiet pianist, a hidden code, and Miss Marple listening closely. Welcome to Enigma Obieto. I am your host Alexander. Let's keep this community buzzing. Drop a comment with where you're watching from. Your messages make this mystery even more thrilling to share. Now, let's begin. The morning of the St. Bed's summer garden party dawned with all the promise of good weather, full teacups, and innocent gossip. The sort of cheerful occasion beloved by the ladies of Little Wythorn. A village so picturesque it looked as though it had been stitched together from old postcards and Sunday sermons. Children dashed between tables set with sponge cake and home-made elderflower cordial, while old Major Willoughby boomed opinions over the bandstand where young Clara Sims played the piano with dutiful precision. Miss Marple, seated beneath a striped parasol, accepted her tea with a soft thank you, dear, and listened. She was very good at listening. The cricket match could be heard in the distance, punctuated by occasional cheers and groans, but closer at hand. Conversation turned to the newcomers at Hawthorne Rise. He's a concert pianist, or was, whispered Mrs. Lavinia Pruitt, her voice laced with admiration and just a hint of suspicion. Maurice Duchamp, French or Belgian, one never knows. Odd-looking man, added Mr. Petherick, the retired solicitor, biting into a jam tart with more aggression than necessary. Lives with his sister, or perhaps not his sister, no one's quite sure. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes turned to where the supposed Maurice Duchamp now stood near the hydrangeas, tall and severe, accepting compliments with a stilted smile. His accent was indeed foreign, but his air was unmistakably English in its detachment. Next to him stood a woman in grey, much younger than he, but not young. She wore no ring and had the tense posture of someone always prepared for interruption. It was Clara Sims, still seated at the piano, who first noticed something wrong. The last piece lilting Debussy nocturne had barely finished when she stood abruptly, her face pale. "I think something's wrong with Mr. Duchamp," she stammered. All heads turned. Duchamp stood quite still, his fingers frozen in midair, as though plucking a note from silence. His face had gone oddly slack. Then he collapsed. The scream came a moment later from the woman in grey, who rushed to him with a cry of Maurice before catching herself, her accent momentarily slipping to something far less refined. It took only a few moments for Dr. Hargrove to push through the crowd, but too late. Maurice Duchamp was dead. Heart, the doctor said with a perfunctory sigh. Seen it before in men like him. Overwork, no doubt, or stress. The woman in grey wept, clutching at a handkerchief. Clara Sims sat at the piano, trembling. Miss Marple, who had not moved from her chair, stirred her tea slowly and looked toward the half-finished cup Duchamp had left on the table beside the roses. She did not speak, but she noticed. She always noticed. The death of Maurice Duchamp settled over Little Wythorn like a fine layer of summer dust, light enough to be brushed off by the practical-minded, but noticeable to all who had eyes to see. By Monday morning, the garden party was already being spoken of in the past tense, as if its gaiety had never quite existed, the music now a haunting echo rather than a festive backdrop. Yet in the tea-room of St. Bed's Hall, the event lived on, dissected in murmurs and flurries of speculation that fluttered between the teacups and sugar bowls. Miss Marple sat at her usual table near the window, knitting needles clicking with a gentle rhythm, her scarf moss green with a tasteful edge of cream was coming along nicely. She listened as the villagers performed their daily symphony of concern, theory, and assumption. "Must have been the strain of his performances," offered Mrs. Lavinia Pruitt, pouring herself another cup of Assam without waiting for anyone to offer. "I read once that pianists have terribly delicate hearts, or that emotion, or perhaps something." "He ate," ventured Mr. Petherick, who had developed a rather sudden interest in medical matters since Dr. Hargrove's offhand comment. "He was halfway through a ginger biscuit when it happened. Could have been an allergy. Poison, whispered Clara Sims with a sharpness that startled even herself. She sat at the far end of the room, hunched slightly forward, eyes red from either crying or lack of sleep. That's what it was. I felt it the moment he fell. Now, Clara, chided Miss Emmeline Crowthorne, the piano teacher and local authority on anything remotely artistic, let's not indulge in melodrama. Maurice Duchamp was not the sort to be murdered in a tea garden. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, blue eyes clear and placid. Oh, but that's just the thing, isn't it? She said mildly. It's never the sort you expect. So often it's the quiet ones, the clever ones, or those who cause the least fuss. And if one wanted to kill someone, surely doing so in broad daylight, in a place where it would appear natural, well, that would be rather clever, don't you think? A hush fell for just a moment. The room held its breath, then Mrs. Pruitt let out a soft chuckle, uncertain but relieved. You always say the most extraordinary things, Miss Marple, she said with a shaky smile. I dare say I do, Miss Marple agreed. Returning to her knitting with gentle focus, outside, the village continued in its usual routine, but something had shifted. The laughter was more subdued, the greetings more cautious. At the grocer's, customers lowered their voices when discussing the Duchamp matter. At the vicarage, Reverend Caldwell quietly added the pianist's name to the list of the deceased, though he hesitated over the cause in a village so accustomed to deaths of the expected short old age, pneumonia, the occasional fall on the stairs. This was a rupture in the norm. The most persistent questions centered not around Maurice Duchamp's death, but around his life. Who was he, really, and why had he come to Little Wythorn? A place so small it barely warranted a spot on the county maps. He had arrived 6 months prior, taking up residence in Hawthorne Rise, a Tudor-style cottage that had sat unoccupied since the Jenkins sisters had passed away within a week of each other 2 winters ago. His companion, the solemn woman who called herself Miss Adele Duchamp, was always introduced as his sister, though no one had seen documents to prove it. She spoke little at village gatherings and attended church only occasionally, wearing black even before the morning began. It was she, now, who occupied most minds. Never did trust her, muttered Bertie Rolls, the milkman, as he adjusted his cap and stood chatting with the postmistress. Too quiet, always watchin', like a cat waitin' for somethin' to fall off the shelf. I heard they weren't brother and sister at all, the postmistress whispered. He called her my dear once, in the butcher's queue. Not something you say to your sister, is it? Meanwhile, the police had taken up the case with what might be called polite reluctance. Inspector Creighton, a portly man with a fondness for digestive biscuits and an intolerance for anything unsolved, visited the scene that same afternoon. He examined the garden, the tea table, and the half-drink cup with all the enthusiasm of a man hoping to find nothing. It's clear to me, he told Miss Marple, whom he found seated by the roses as though the party had never ended, that this was natural causes. The man was old, foreign, and likely stressed. End of story. Miss Marple smiled gently, not unkindly. He was 63, she said. I wouldn't call that old, Inspector, not these days. Yes, well, artistic temperament, he grunted, they tend to burn out young. And yet, she said, stirring her tea with a slow hand, Mr. Duchamp's routine was remarkably consistent. He played piano every morning from 10 until noon, took a walk at 2:30, read French novels on the terrace when weather permitted, and every Friday afternoon he came here to this very spot and had 1 cup of Darjeeling with lemon and a single ginger biscuit. The inspector raised his brow. You've been watching him. I've been sitting in my garden, she replied calmly. The 2 activities are not mutually exclusive, Creighton snorted, and not unkindly. But he made no note of her comment. Instead, He tipped his hat and said he'd send for the coroner's report within the week, though he doubted it would yield anything unusual. Miss Marple watched him go, her expression unreadable. Behind her, the chairs and tables from the party had been cleared, but a few rose petals lingered in the grass, like remnants of a dream. Later that evening, she returned to her cottage, accompanied only by the sound of distant piano scales coming faintly from Clara Sims's home down the lane. The notes were hesitant, unsure each one like a question seeking an answer. She paused before entering, eyes fixed on the post box outside her gate. Inside it, a letter waited, no stamp. No return address. She picked it up, examined the paper. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate. It read he never played on Sundays, but I heard the piano that morning. Miss Marple looked up toward the fading sunset. The sky was streaked with pink and ash. She folded the note, placed it carefully in her apron pocket, and went inside without a word. The next morning, she baked a Victoria sponge and brought it to the Sims household, where Clara answered the door with red eyes and flour on her cheek. "Dear child," Miss Marple said gently, "I thought you might like some company. Grief is a terrible sort of silence, and I always find cake helps with the noise." Clara hesitated, then stepped aside. "He was scared the day before," she said softly. "He didn't say it, but I saw it in the way he played. Something was off, wrong notes, missed rhythms." Maurice never did that. Miss Marple offered her hand, not to take Clara's, but to set the cake down on the small side table just inside the door. "I wonder, Clara dear," she said with the mildest of smiles, "if you might remember anything else. Something small, perhaps. Something that didn't feel important at the time." Clara looked away, as if retrieving the memory from a locked drawer. "There was a man, not from the village. He came on Thursday evening. I thought he might be a student, but Maurice looked frightened when he saw him, truly frightened." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I see." In the garden, bees moved lazily from blossom to blossom, unaware of the weight that hung in the air like an unanswered chord. Somewhere, a clock struck 11, and in Miss Marple's gentle hands, the mystery began to tighten its shape. By Wednesday, the village of Little Wythorn was no longer whispering about Maurice Duchamp's sudden death in vague terms of tragedy and misfortune. Something had shifted in the collective consciousness. The quiet suggestion that his demise might not have been as innocent as it first appeared had taken root. Not that anyone would say so directly. Of course, this was a place of civility and tact, but the way people lowered their voices when passing Hawthorne Rise, the sidelong glances exchanged in the grocer's queue, and the fact that Inspector Creighton had returned not once, but twice, all spoke volumes. Miss Marple, however, did not return to the tea-room, nor did she share her suspicions in drawing-room circles or over scones. Instead, she paid careful visits, each one gentle and purposeful, to those who might unknowingly hold the missing pieces of a very puzzling picture. Her next stop was the post office, where Miss Hetty Gudgeon, sprightly despite being well into her 60s, presided with a blend of efficiency and unwavering curiosity. "Good morning, Miss Gudgeon," Miss Marple said, entering with a mild smile. "I thought I might post a parcel to my nephew Raymond. Just a book he lent me some months ago and is rather keen to have returned." "Of course, Miss Marple," Hetty replied, already reaching for string and brown paper. "Always so punctual with your correspondence, unlike some around here. Mrs. Archer hasn't collected her mail in 2 days, and it's piling up like the parish notice board." Miss Marple offered a gentle laugh, setting the book on the counter. "Village life is full of little delays," she said lightly, "though I imagine you still see most comings and goings. Has it been particularly busy this week?" Hetty hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Well, now that you mention it, there was a gentleman here on Thursday. Unfamiliar face. Not one of ours. Thursday." Miss Marple repeated softly. That would be the evening before poor Mr. Duchamp died. Hetty nodded, beginning to wrap the parcel. Yes, precisely, just before closing. Tall fellow, dark coat, strange accent, not French, mind you, Eastern European perhaps. Said he had an urgent delivery for Hawthorne Rise, but wouldn't leave it. With me, I wanted to take it myself. I told him that wasn't the done thing, but he just smiled and walked off like he'd never heard me. How curious, Miss Marple said, eyes serene, and no return address or name. None. But he had something in a small case, leather-bound. It looked like one of those old folios musicians carry. You know. For sheet music, Miss Marple's needles clicked in her bag, though her hands didn't move. Her voice remained casual. I wonder, Miss Gudgeon, if you happened to see which way he went, straight up toward Hawthorne Rise. Same direction as always. That place gives me the chills, if I'm honest. So empty at night, like it's holding its breath. Miss Marple collected her receipt and thanked her kindly. Outside, the lane stretched ahead in its familiar, well-trodden way, but the shadows cast by the hedgerows seemed to stretch a little longer that morning. She turned left instead of right. Following the hill up toward Hawthorne Rise, the cottage, despite its neat hedges and prim windows, had a sombre air about it now, as if it mourned along with its occupant. The blinds were drawn. No smoke rose from the chimney. No music filtered through the stone walls. She knocked gently. It was Adele Duchamp who answered, her figure thin and tremulous in the doorway. She wore black, though not traditional mourning. Attire more like a uniform. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp. Miss Marple, she said simply, my dear, I hope I'm not intruding. I came only to offer my condolences and perhaps a bit of Victoria sponge. The hesitation was brief then. The door opened wider. Inside, the air was heavy with silence. The piano sat in the corner, a metronome still perched beside it. A pair of Morris's spectacles rested on the sideboard, as if waiting for their owner to retrieve them. Please, Adele said softly. Come in. Miss Marple took a seat near the window. Setting the tin of cake on the low table, her eyes swept the room, unhurried, polite. She noticed the framed photographs on the wall, Morris at the piano, Adele in a conservatory, another of the two of them beside a grand concert hall. Yet none of them looked truly candid. He was a remarkable man, Miss Marple said after a pause. Gifted, disciplined, but I felt anxious. Perhaps Adele looked away, her hands clutched in her lap. He had been afraid. Yes, for weeks, but he would not tell me why. Was it someone from his past? Adele's expression tightened. We do not speak of his past. Miss Marple tilted her head. Even when it threatens the present. Adele was silent for a long time. Then, as if a dam had cracked, she whispered, there was a letter, last month. No name, just a symbol on the envelope, a treble clef inked in red. Maurice burned it. Miss Marple nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. And the visitor last Thursday. Adele flinched. Do you know him? I heard there was a man, dark coat, not English. Carried music. Adele stood abruptly, walking toward the window, arms folded across her chest. He was not from the conservatory, not from any school. He never gave a name, but Maurice knew him. The moment he saw him, something changed in his face. It was like he'd seen a ghost. Miss Marple waited. Adele continued. He demanded to speak to Maurice alone. They argued. I could hear it through the door snatches of another language, threats. Something about a debt. Maurice refused. Then the man left, but Maurice couldn't sleep after that, and yet he performed at the garden party. He insisted. He said the village must not suspect. He wanted to appear as though nothing had happened, but he made me promise to look into the old scores if anything happened to him. Miss Marple blinked. The old scores. Adele moved to the piano, lifting the seat to reveal a shallow compartment. Inside were neatly stacked folders, each labelled in Morris's hand. She removed one, carefully placing it on the table. He told me there was something hidden, a pattern, a code. Miss Marple's gaze rested on the music. Did he say why someone would wish to harm him over it? Adele's voice was barely above. A whisper. He was a courier, Miss Marple, during the war, not just a musician. He smuggled information coded through music, hidden in performance programs, even after the war. There were secrets. Some he told me, many he didn't. Miss Marple reached forward and gently touched the folder. We may find more answers here than we expect. But it is often the silences between the notes that say the most. Adele nodded. Tears pooling in her eyes outside. A breeze stirred the ivy along the walls of the cottage. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked and a child laughed. But inside Hawthorne Rise, the past had begun to play its melody once more, and Miss Marple was already reading the music. She rose, placing her hand briefly on Adele's shoulder. I shall call again soon, my dear. In the meantime, do nothing rash. And should any more letters arrive, I will come to you at once. As Miss Marple stepped out into the sunlight, she glanced up at the clouds gathering on the horizon. There was something in the air now, unease, but also revelation, and though the piano was silent, the next note was waiting to be struck. It was Thursday again in Little Wythorn. Exactly 1 week since Maurice Duchamp's collapse at the garden party. The lilies at St. Bed's were still fresh, though the air around the village had turned cooler, crisper, as if time itself were taking a breath, but beneath the veneer of order and routine. Something was shifting. The village, ever discreet, was now watching itself, and Miss Marple, with her knitting in one hand and her teacup in the other, was watching the village. From her window overlooking the lane, she could see the slow, methodical life of Little Wythorn go onwards. Archer trimmed her roses too aggressively, young Oliver Dinnock chasing a wayward chicken down the cobbled path, and, interestingly, a figure unknown to her taking tea outside the fern and thistle. She narrowed her eyes slightly, not rudely, but with intent. The man sat alone, a thick book open before him and a small notepad resting by his saucer. He wore a grey wool coat, rather fine for a village like theirs, and dark gloves that he had removed only moments earlier. But what caught Miss Marple's sharp gaze was the cuff of his shirt, white linen, faintly stained with what appeared to be black ink. Not smudged, but dabbed, a tiny blot near the buttonhole. It was the kind of thing most would overlook. Miss Marple never overlooked anything. That afternoon, she made her way down to the fern and thistle with the excuse of picking up scones. The innkeeper, George Pelling, greeted her warmly and offered his usual tale of how his scones were winning over even the most devoted of the church ladies. But Miss Marple's attention remained fixed on the stranger, who now appeared engrossed in his reading, though his eyes flicked up every time the door opened. Passing through, "Is he?" she asked mildly, wrapping her scarf a little tighter. Pelling looked over his shoulder. Him, said he was down from London, research of some kind, been here since Tuesday, though I've not seen a single notebook come out, bit of a quiet one. Doesn't say much. Miss Marple accepted the parcel of scones and offered a smile. Well, George, some people say too much, and others say too little, but both can be suspicious when the weather's uncertain. She stepped outside, where the air was brisk and smelled faintly of damp leaves. The man's eyes followed her subtly as she passed. She inclined her head politely. He offered a neutral smile, his fingers idly drumming against the table. That evening, she wrote a brief note to Inspector Creighton, nothing overt, just a mention of the visitor with an ink-stained cuff and a tendency to watch doors rather than read books. She made no accusations. Miss Marple did not accuse. She observed. The next day brought further whispers. Clara Sims had been seen speaking with the stranger outside the post office. Their conversation was brief, But Clara's face had looked drawn afterward, her step hurried. Miss Marple paid Clara a second visit late that morning. This time, under the pretense of returning a borrowed cookbook, she found the girl seated at the piano, fingers resting silently on the keys. He asked about Maurice, Clara said without being prompted, said he was researching wartime musicians, but his questions were strange. He knew about the codes, Miss Marple. He knew Maurice had done more than play music. Miss Marple nodded slowly, lowering herself into the armchair near the hearth. Did he say where he was from? London, he claimed, but his accent's not quite right. And he kept pressing me about a piece Maurice played, often something called Nocturne for the Fallen Bird. He said it was composed during the war and might hold secrets. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. I remember Maurice played it the morning of the garden party. I noticed a small tremor in his left hand during the second movement. Something troubled him deeply. Clara's brow furrowed. He always played it on Sundays, and never for others, but that week he broke his pattern. He played it 3 days in a row. Miss Marple leaned forward. Patterns matter, Clara, especially when broken. We form them to feel safe when someone changes their rhythm. It often means something has intruded upon it. Clara looked at her with wide eyes. Do you think he left something behind? In the music, Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. My dear, I think he may have left more than one thing, and I believe someone is very determined to find it later that afternoon. Miss Marple visited Adele Duchamp once more. The curtains were drawn and the house smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish. Adele looked tired but alert. There is something else, she said as they sat beside the piano. Maurice kept a journal of more sketches and notes than writing. It was never out in the open. After his death, I couldn't find it. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the row of music books still stacked neatly in the cabinet. I don't suppose he hid anything in the piano itself. Adele blinked. Do you think so? With men like Maurice, Miss Marple said kindly, the instrument is not only a tool, but a companion, a confidant. Together, they lifted the lid and examined the frame. It was Clara who eventually spotted a false panel just beneath the keyboard. A narrow space no thicker than a music score. Inside, wrapped in aged cloth, was a leather-bound book. Adele's hands trembled as she unwrapped it. The pages were filled with musical notations, scribbles in French, and symbols, some coded, others seemingly nonsensical. But one thing stood out. A repeated motif is a treble clef in red ink, marked beside a series of dates, not regular dates, but those corresponding with wartime movements. Miss Marple recognized at least 3 as coinciding with bombings near rail depots in southern France, and then, on the final page, a name, Vasily Morin. Adele whispered, her voice trembling. Miss Marple looked at her steadily. You recognize it. He was one of them, she said. A Soviet contact, part of the resistance network. He and Maurice had disagreements after the war. They parted ways. Maurice feared him. Miss Marple closed the book gently. I believe our visitor is using a different name now, but his stains on his cuff, in his manner, are not easily washed away. Adele clutched the book to her chest. Do you think he'll come for this? Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, but he'll not find what he seeks, for he doesn't understand Morris's final act. I think this code leads to something else, a location, perhaps, or a name yet hidden. That night, Miss Marple left a second note for Inspector Creighton, this one more urgent. The stranger was still at the Fern and Thistle when the police arrived the next morning. He did not resist, but neither did he answer questions. No passport, no identity, only a briefcase filled with forged articles on musical scholarship and an old photograph of Maurice Duchamp, dated 1943. By then, the village was murmuring again, this time with relief, though not without unease. Another layer had peeled away. Another secret exposed, but Miss Marple knew the mystery had not yet been resolved, for what Maurice had died protecting remained undiscovered, and the music still lingered in the air, waiting for its final note. The weekend passed with a strange, muted stillness. In Little Wythorn, Sunday services were conducted as usual. But the congregation was quieter, more alert, even reverend. Caldwell, who prided himself on never preaching longer than 20 minutes, added an unscripted reflection at the end, something about hidden burdens and the weight of silence. The organist, Mrs. Bates, played with her usual enthusiasm, but her hands trembled ever so slightly during the recessional hymn. Miss Marple sat in the third pew from the back, hands folded in her lap, her gaze calm but far away. She was not thinking about the sermon, she was thinking about E minor, specifically. The way Maurice Duchamp had begun the second movement of his nocturne for the fallen bird in that key the morning before he died. She had heard it many times over the months. He'd lived in the village, often drifting through the trees as she trimmed her roses or stirred her teacup on the terrace. It was always the same, except that last time, it wasn't just the key, it was the tempo, slower, more deliberate, hesitant, even, a man waiting for something, or perhaps warning someone. That thought lingered as she stepped out into the Sunday sun, where Clara Sims stood awkwardly near the church gate, her music folder clutched to her chest. "Miss Marple," Clara said, as if she'd been waiting. "My dear," Miss Marple replied gently, "you look rather like someone with something to say." Clara nodded and fell into step beside her. "I think there's something in the music. I played the nocturne again this morning, and something felt off, not just emotionally. Technically, there are 3 measures that don't align with the rest. They're desyncopated, not like Maurice. Show me." Miss Marple said without hesitation. The 2 women returned to Clara's modest cottage, where the piano stood in a bright sitting room, slightly dusty but well loved. Clara flipped open her folder and laid out the sheet music, her fingers brushing over the notes. "Here," she pointed, "measure 23 through 25. See how the rhythm breaks. And there he's written a fermata, but it doesn't belong." Miss Marple leaned forward. 3 measures, that's not accidental. Musicians don't break form unless they're trying to signal something. Clara nodded. "I thought perhaps he was hiding a message. I remember once, he told me about Shostakovich using musical cryptograms embedding names into melodies." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I recall such techniques. And Maurice would have known many ways to speak through music, particularly if he'd used it during the war. Tell me, Clara, what happens if you play those measures backwards?" Clara looked startled, then curious. She adjusted her posture and played the 3 bars slowly, reversing the sequence. The notes fell differently, haunting, but clearer, less mournful, almost intentional, now that Miss Marple murmured, "It sounds like someone calling for help." They stared at each other for a moment, a silent understanding passing between them. Something more lay within the music, buried like a seed beneath the soil. That evening, Miss Marple made a quiet trip to Hawthorne Rise. Adele Duchamp answered the door. Looking thinner and more alert than before, her hands were ink-stained, as if she'd spent the day examining Maurice's coded journal. "There's something more in the music," Miss Marple told her gently, and explained what Clara had found. Adele led her straight to the piano. They opened the cabinet and retrieved the original manuscript, the one Maurice had kept hidden, separate from the published version. There, in the margins of those same 3 bars, were tiny marks. Not notes, letters, barely perceptible. EMW 12, Adele stared. "He used initials before," she whispered, "but always for names, not numbers." Miss Marple's eyes didn't leave the page. "EMW, could that be a person?" Adele shook her head. "Not someone I know. But Maurice used initials in one other Place his wartime dispatches. In code, EMW might stand for a location, possibly in German or Russian, and 12 a locker, a key, a date. Miss Marple pressed her fingertips together. It could be many things, but I believe it points us not to something hidden far away, but something here. He wanted someone to find this. But not just anyone. That night, Miss Marple sat with the coded journal again. She examined the red treble clef symbols, which appeared 11 times, but on one page, near the middle. There were two clefs drawn back to back, forming an image almost like a mirrored S, and in the margin, in pencil so faint it could barely be seen without the firelight, Maurice had written, "When you hear the song backwards, open the cabinet below E minor, you'll know." The next morning, just after sunrise, Miss Marple and Adele returned to Maurice's music room. They removed the panel beneath the piano's keyboard, just beneath the low E string. There, tucked behind the inner frame, they found a narrow compartment, no larger than a dictionary. Inside it was a velvet pouch. Adele opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a small stack of letters, some dated as early as 1943, others postmarked only months before Maurice's death. But the final item was what drew Miss Marple's focus: a key, brass, numbered 12. Stamped into its head was the marking EMW, London. Adele exhaled slowly. A safety deposit box. Miss Marple nodded. I suspect the last remnants of Maurice's past reside there, perhaps evidence of those he helped, or those he once evaded. But it wasn't for the authorities he left this trail. It was for someone he trusted. Me, Adele whispered. You, Miss Marple said. He never told you everything, not because he doubted your loyalty, but because he feared for your safety. But when the danger became real again, when Vasily returned, he knew it was time, and he knew you'd need help. Adele clutched the pouch to her chest. I don't even know what's in it. No. Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. But I dare say someone else does, and they're not finished looking. Just then, a knock sounded at the front door, sharp, twice. Adele froze. Miss Marple stood with the slow, deliberate poise of someone who had seen danger before. She moved to the curtain, peered through a narrow slit. It was Clara, but she wasn't. Alone, standing just behind her, half in shadow, was a figure Miss Marple had never seen, but immediately distrusted. To polished, to still, she turned back to Adele. Keep the key hidden. Say nothing. Let me speak first. The door opened. Clara's face was pale, her lips pressed tightly together. This is Mr. Fenwick, she said quietly. He says he's from the conservatory. He wanted to speak with Adele about Maurice's unpublished works. The man stepped forward, his voice smooth and cultured. Such a tragedy, Miss Duchamp. We're compiling a retrospective. We hoped to locate any pieces Maurice may have left behind, particularly the Nocturne for the Fallen Bird. It's said to contain one of his most personal signatures, Adele said. Nothing. Miss Marple, however, smiled kindly. How nice, she said. I imagine such a rare composition would fetch a handsome sum in certain circles. Fenwick's eyes flicked toward her. I'm here for history, not commerce, of course, Miss Marple replied. And yet, one wonders what kind of historian arrives a week after a man's death and already knows which measure hides his secrets. Fenwick's face remained composed, but something shifted in his posture, his fingers tightening just a fraction too fast. Miss Marple noticed. She always did, and in that moment, she knew. They had not yet reached the heart of the mystery, but its shadow had stepped over the threshold. Mr. Fenwick stood just inside the doorway of Hawthorne Rise, his silhouette crisply outlined by the late morning light. He appeared perfectly calm, unruffled, with the polite confidence of someone used to having doors opened for him. But Miss Marple had long since learned that composure was not necessarily a sign of innocence. Sometimes it was the mask of predator. Wore best, Clara Sims lingered near the umbrella stand, uncertain and slightly flushed. Adele Duchamp stood behind Miss Marple, silent. One hand resting on the music cabinet as if drawing strength from its solid. "Lacquered wood, you said you're compiling a retrospective," Miss Marple asked mildly, gesturing to the man's briefcase. "I don't recall seeing your name in the conservatory's annual bulletin. I subscribe. You know, their list of researchers is always so thorough." Fenwick's lips curled into what might have passed for a smile. "Independent scholarship, Miss Marple," she supplied. "Ah, yes, of course, I have heard of you." The lady detective, with a fondness for tea and roses, she gave a slight nod. "I believe in the value of close observation, particularly when it comes to men who appear scholarly but forget to blink when watching others speak." He tilted his head, clearly re-evaluating her. "I assure you, I am here in good faith. Mr. Duchamp's work is of significant interest to a number of cultural institutions. I thought it best to speak directly with his closest relation." Adele, still silent, looked toward Miss Marple. "Do you have credentials?" Miss Marple asked, stepping in gently but firmly. "A letter of intent? A contact at your supposed institution? Anything at all that might confirm your identity?" Fenwick's gaze sharpened, just briefly. Then, without a word, he reached into the breast pocket of his coat and produced a slim leather wallet. Inside was a card embossed, professional-looking, but oddly pristine for a man supposedly travelling through the countryside. Miss Marple accepted it and examined it with care. "London School of Music Archives," she murmured. "No phone number. No postal address. Rather old-fashioned, isn't it?" Fenwick didn't answer. His expression remained pleasant but distant. Before Miss Marple could press further, Adele stepped forward, finally finding her voice. "Mr. Fenwick, my brother kept a few unpublished works, but I'm afraid the ones he did leave behind are personal. If you are truly interested in his legacy, perhaps you'd allow me time to consult with his solicitor before releasing any material." Fenwick's jaw tensed, but he bowed slightly. "Of course, take the time you need." He turned to leave, but Miss Marple followed him to the door. "One last thing," she said. "You mentioned the Nocturne for the Fallen Bird, not a widely known piece, even among Morris's admirers. I wonder how you came to learn of it." Fenwick glanced over his shoulder, the smile no longer quite reaching his eyes. "As I said, Miss Marple, those of us who study great musicians tend to dig a little deeper than the surface." And with that, he stepped out into the lane, disappearing down the path with slow, purposeful steps. Miss Marple closed the door quietly, then turned to Adele. "He'll be back," she said. "And not for music history." Adele's hands clenched around the hem of her sleeve. "Do you think he knows about the journal, the key?" "He suspects, but he doesn't know for certain. If he did, he would have tried to take it today. He's being cautious." Watching, Clara, who had been standing awkwardly to the side, finally spoke. "Do you think he's the one who threatened Maurice?" Miss Marple considered for a moment, then shook her head. "No, I think he's someone else entirely. A scavenger, not an assassin. Someone who found traces of Morris's past and saw the opportunity for gain. He may be working for others, or he may be acting on his own. Either way, he's dangerous." Adele crossed to the piano and sat down, the keys untouched beneath her fingers. "I don't understand what they want. The music, the code, the key, what's in that box in London that matters so much?" Miss Marple reached into her handbag and withdrew Morris's journal. She laid it flat on the table and opened it to the middle, where the double red treble clefs were drawn in mirror. "This symbol," she said softly, "is not just a flourish, it's a cipher marker. Maurice used it to identify pages that contained embedded information. There are 4 of them in the journal. I believe they correspond to 4 locations, sir, perhaps for events each linked to names or items hidden during his time with the resistance." Adele looked up sharply. But the war's over. It's been over for years. Miss Marple gave a quiet nod. Wars may end, but the consequences linger. Some people profit from what was hidden. Others fear the exposure of what they once did. Clara frowned, leaning closer. So this isn't just about music. No, my dear, it's about history, and what people will do to keep their part in it secret that afternoon. Miss Marple walked the familiar lane back toward her cottage. The wind had picked up, rustling the hedgerows and stirring the crows from the yew trees. She passed the village green, where a few children played half-heartedly, their laughter uncertain in the breeze, at home. She set the journal down beside the wireless and poured herself a cup of tea. The notes from the nocturne echoed faintly. In her mind the strange, discordant three-bar section Clara had identified. She hummed it softly, then reached for the knitting needles she had left untouched since the garden party. But her mind was not on stitches, it was in rhythm, and then it struck her. The backwards section Clara had played, when transposed and slowed, resembled an old folk melody, not English, but Slavic. Something she'd heard once at a wartime benefit. In London, a song smuggled in code, the refrain had been a message location. The melody wasn't just a cipher. It was a map. She stood abruptly and crossed to her bookshelf, where she kept a slim, rarely touched volume Melodies of the Occupied Lands, 1940 to 1945. Within a minute, she found it. Page 114. Swan over the Black River, a melody used by Polish-resistant cells to signal safe houses during occupation. The version in Morris's Nocturne was nearly identical. She tapped the page. Her heart beating faster. It wasn't just a hidden locker in London. It was a trail, a breadcrumb path through old secrets. The next morning, Miss Marple met with Inspector Creighton. "I need a favour," she said without preamble. "I believe Mr. Duchamp's safety deposit box is at the Eastern Metropolitan Wing Bank in Bloomsbury. Number 12. I'd like someone present when it opens." Creighton gave her a long, appraising look. "You're asking me to believe a dead pianist encoded his secrets in music and left you the clues." Miss Marple offered her calmest smile. "I'm asking you to believe in human nature, in its flaws, its fears and its patterns." He sighed but made the arrangements. By Tuesday, Adele and Miss Marple were in London, standing in the quiet, marbled interior of the EMW branch. The key fit the box perfectly. Inside was a manila envelope, thick, heavy, and as Adele opened it, a small slip of paper fluttered to the ground. It read, "If they find this, the music will speak for me. Tell the truth before it is rewritten." MD Miss Marple lifted her gaze from the letter, but she did not smile. For she knew that the game was not over. Someone was still playing, and the final movement had yet to begin. The contents of Maurice Duchamp's deposit box lay spread across the table in Miss Marple's parlour like a quiet confession, layers of yellowed correspondence, notated sheet music, and typed reports bearing the mottled stamps of wartime secrecy. A single photograph had caught Adele's eye and refused to let go of a black and white image of Maurice seated at a grand piano in a Paris salon, his posture tense, his expression somewhere between performance and panic. Standing in the corner of the photograph, barely visible in the shadowed edge, was a man in a military-style coat, watching him intently. "That's him," Adele had whispered. "That's Vasily Morin, now." Back in Little Wythorn, the unease that had temporarily ebbed with the man's arrest returned like a tide. Because it wasn't Vasily they had seen at the Fern and Thistle, it was Fenwick, and if Maurice had feared one man from the past, it now seemed there were two. The envelope from the box contained, among the relics, a letter addressed to A. D. Adele Duchamp. "My dearest sister, if this reaches you, then the final curtain has fallen. Know first that I loved you, and that what I kept from you was for your protection, not from mistrust. There are things I did during the warthings I was proud of, and others I cannot forget. Among these papers is the full copy of the Nocturne for the Fallen Bird, the uncensored version, the true one. Within it, I left the names of 3 men I once worked beside, who later betrayed what we fought for. One of them is still at large. I believe he has found me again. He goes by another name now, but his past clings to him like smoke. I ask you to finish what I could not. Let the truth out. The music will guide you. The room was silent as Adele finished reading aloud. Her voice trembled, but her eyes remained dry. Do you think the man in the one calling himself Fenwickdo, you believe he is the last of those men? She asked. Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she leaned forward and studied the final sheet of music among Morris's private notes. It was a revised page of the Nocturne, annotated more heavily than any other, with notations not only in treble and bass, but in lettered ciphers that danced between the staffs. I think, she said slowly, that whoever he is searching for more than just a composition. He wants to control the story, perhaps to bury it, perhaps to use it. Clara Sims, seated beside the hearth with her hands folded tightly in her lap, spoke for the first time in several minutes. He came to see me again yesterday. Both women turned to her. He waited until after my piano lesson with the vicar's daughter, Clara continued, said he'd like to hear me play the Nocturne. I told him I didn't have the original, only a simplified version Maurice had transcribed for me. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. And did he believe you? I think so, Clara said, but he was agitated. He asked strange questions, wanted to know if Maurice had spoken about other musicians. Old colleagues, other performers who worked with the Resistance. Did he give any names? Only one, Reiner, said he might be in Sussex. I said I didn't know the name. He seemed to be gauging my reaction. Adele inhaled sharply. Reiner was one of them, she said. Maurice mentioned him once. A violinist, German by birth, but changed his name after the war. He helped smuggle scores across borders, but he was always unpredictable. Maurice believed he had been compromised. Miss Marple nodded slowly. If Fenwick is looking for Reiner, then he believes the trail has not gone cold. But more importantly, he believes the key to finding him is still hidden in the music. She tapped the corner of the annotated page, and here, I believe, is where that key lies. Adele leaned over the score. But it's just notation. Sharps, rests, phrasing marks not entirely, Miss Marple said. See this run here? It doesn't make musical sense in context, but if you treat the first note of each bar as a letter to G, repeating you begin to form patterns. And this cluster, here, spells out Reiner. Clara sat forward, so he embedded names in the notes, exactly, just as he once did for Resistance contacts, but he also included dates and places. Look her E3, B5, D2, that could correspond to coordinates, train schedules, or even catalogue references. Adele sat back in her chair, visibly shaken, all this time. He was composing more than music, he was composing their memory, Miss Marple's gaze turned thoughtful. He knew the people who would come for him wouldn't search for files or fingerprints, they'd search for his silence, for the gaps between the bars, for the music that only some could read. Outside, a breeze stirred the hedgerows and rattled the garden gate. The day was overcast, with clouds hanging low over the village like damp sheets on a line. Miss Marple stood. I believe it's time we paid Mr. Fenwick another visit. They found him in the same corner of the Fern and Thistle, seated at the table near the window, a pot of tea steaming before him, and his ever-present briefcase resting on the floor beside his polished shoe. He looked up as they entered, and his smile appeared before he spoke. Ladies, to what do I owe the pleasure? Miss Marple returned the smile with one of her own, light but direct, to music. Of course, I had a question about one of Morris's pieces. I wonder if you'd humour me for a moment. Fenwick gestured to the seat across from him. Always happy to discuss art, Miss Marple did not sit. Do you recall the second movement of Nocturne for the Fallen Bird? Vaguely, he said. Then perhaps you can tell me how many times the phrase in E minor repeats in the original score. Fenwick hesitated. 3 times. Miss Marple shook her head. In Morris's earliest published version, it repeats 4 times. But in the version you were never supposed to see the one he hid in a piano bench, it repeats only twice, because the 3rd iteration is altered, inverted, and hides a name, yours. The silence around the table thickened. Fenwick didn't move, not visibly, but something in his eyes narrowed only a hair's breadth. That's quite the theory, he said smoothly. It's more than a theory, Miss Marple replied. It's written in the language you know best. The language you've been trying to erase from every surviving copy. Fenwick pushed back his chair. Well, then it seems I've overstayed my welcome in your little village. He picked up his briefcase. You won't get far, Miss Marple said, her tone still polite. Inspector Creighton has a copy of Morris's full score now, along with your photograph taken from Morris's personal effects. Not a flattering image, I'm afraid. Wartime photos rarely are. Fenwick looked at her long and hard. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the inn. They did not follow him, because at that moment Inspector Creighton stepped into view outside the door, flanked by 2 plainclothes men from the regional office. It was over before the hour turned. Later that evening, back at Hawthorne Rise, Adele lit a candle and placed it beside the piano. She did not speak. She simply opened Morris's score and began to play. The notes filled the house like breath. Like memory dark, mournful, and ultimately resolute, Miss Marple, seated nearby, listened with eyes half closed. Because some stories are not spoken, they are played, and they are heard by those who choose to listen. The days following Mr. Fenwick's quiet arrest passed with the slow solemnity of a church bell echoing through autumn fog in Little Wythorn. The weather turned crisp, the trees shedding their leaves in golden sheets, the cobbled lanes lined with brittle reminders of summer's end. But in the minds of those touched by Maurice Duchamp's death, the air remained thick with questions and unresolved chords. Morris's funeral had taken place on a grey morning at St. Bede's. The service was modest, as he would have wished. Adele Duchamp wore navy rather than black and stood quietly throughout the vicar's homily, hands folded and eyes unreadable. Clara Sims played a simple arrangement of Bach on the church piano. Miss Marple, seated in her customary pew, wore her best cloaky hat and did not cry, but her thoughts were deep and ordered. Like shelves in a library she'd not yet finished cataloguing. That afternoon, Adele invited Miss Marple and Clara to Hawthorne Rise once more, ostensibly for tea, but as they sat beside the cold hearth with mismatched teacups in hand, it became evident there was a greater purpose behind the visit. I've decided to go to Paris, Adele said, her voice low but steady. There are names Maurice left in the journal, people I thought long dead or lost to history. But I believe some of them may still be alive, and I think they deserve to know that Maurice kept their secret safe. That someone came for him in the end. Clara set down her cup with a faint clink. Do you think it's wise to dig so deeply, Adele? The man we just handed over, he nearly killed your brother, I know. Adele said, but Maurice wanted the truth to outlive him. He left this for a reason. She stood and crossed to the cabinet where Morris's original composition rested, now wrapped in muslin and tied with a ribbon. She placed it gently on the table before them. I want the piece played, she said, the true version, not the one they published for concert halls. The one with the secrets, the one with the names. Clara stared at the manuscript. You mean perform it publicly? Yes, in London, perhaps, somewhere small, intimate. It doesn't need to make headlines, But I want the music to speak again. Miss Marple's voice, when it came, was soft but firm. You may find resistance, Adele, not from the audience, but from shadows that don't want the light. Fenwick was only a part of it. There are still others. Adele nodded. I know. But I won't live in fear of phantoms. There was something in her eyes resolved, born of grief and clarity. Miss Marple regarded her a moment longer, and then offered a single, quiet nod. Then you must proceed, but carefully, later, as dusk fell over the village. Miss Marple made her way slowly down the lane to her cottage, the leaves beneath her sensible. Shoes crackled, and somewhere far off, a dog barked. She did not walk quickly, for she was deep in thought. The music, the hidden names, the man with the ink-stained cuff, these pieces were settling now, forming a mosaic she could nearly see in its entirety. But there was something missing. Something that hadn't yet emerged, and then, just before turning into her gate, she saw him. A man standing at the end of the lane, not moving, not approaching, just watching. He was tall, wearing a charcoal coat and a soft hat pulled low. The fading light obscured his features. But even from this distance, Miss Marple felt that subtle shift in the air, the kind that comes when you're being watched by someone who's trying very hard not to be seen. She did not stop. She walked to her gate, unlatched it, and stepped inside her garden with the grace of someone performing a ritual. But once behind the hedge, she turned and looked back. He was gone. Inside, she lit the fire and made herself a modest supper, sardines on toast, a pot of tea, and a slice of Dundee cake left from the week before. She ate slowly, her thoughts sharp despite the quietness of her surroundings. After the meal, she drew Morris's journal once more from her bookshelf and turned to the back pages, the ones less heavily marked. A passage caught her eye, not musical notation this time, but a simple paragraph, handwritten in English rather than French. There is another, not Reiner, not Morin, a man who walks the line between performer and pretender. He wore the same face in Berlin and again in Vienna, though he used different names. When he smiles, his right eye squints before the left. That's how you'll know him. He always waits to see who speaks first. I do not know if he's alive, but if he is, he will come. Miss Marple sat very still. She had seen that smile, or something like it. Not Fenwick, someone else, a presence not yet named, but sensed like the final movement of a symphony that had yet to play. The next morning, she returned to the Fern and Thistle. Mr. Pelling, the innkeeper, greeted her with his usual good humour, wiping flour from his hands. Morning, Miss Marple. A little early for tea. I thought I'd inquire about our recent visitor, she said gently. Mr. Fenwick. Did he receive any mail while he was here? Pelling furrowed his brow. Only once, I think. A man brought a note. Didn't post it, just handed it to me and asked that I deliver it to Mr. Fenwick's room. Do you remember what he looked like? Tall, thin, foreign accent, but very soft. Polite, seemed in a hurry. And did you catch his name? No, ma'am, just said it was from a colleague. Miss Marple thanked him and left without another word. Outside, she paused and looked toward the hills beyond the village. If Fenwick had been answering to someone, then it was possible that someone had not yet left Little Wythorn, and that meant the music was not done playing. That evening, she invited Adele and Clara for supper, served in her front parlour by candlelight. Roast chicken, new potatoes, apple tart. It was during dessert that she finally asked the question that had been quietly waiting. Did Maurice ever mention a man who called himself Lachman? Adele blinked, startled. Yes, she said, that was one of the names he feared most. Lachman wasn't a musician, but he passed himself off as one. Said he'd been in the Berlin Philharmonic, but Maurice told me he wasn't listed anywhere. He showed up before an orchestra performance once in 1944, posing as a cellist. Disappeared after one rehearsal. Miss Marple's spoon hovered over her tart. That fits, Clara. Looked between them. Fits what? Miss Marple looked out the window, where the sky was beginning to cloud over again. I believe Lachman is in the village. He's watching, waiting. Perhaps he doesn't know everything yet. But he suspects Maurice left more than notes. Behind, Adele's voice dropped. You think he'll come to me? No, Miss Marple said softly. He'll come to Clara. Clara's eyes widened. Me, why? Because you're the only one who still plays the piece aloud. The rest of us simply read. And in the space between those words, the truth began to take form. There would be one more movement in this piece, and Miss Marple would be listening when it played. The piano in Clara Sims's parlour had never known tension, until now. Its keys had only ever danced beneath her hands to the rhythm of morning, scales and Sunday sonatas. But on this particular Thursday, as late autumn light slanted across the floral rug and the teacups on the mantel stood untouched, the silence in the room was charged. Miss Marple sat in a high-back chair near the window, her knitting resting in her lap, though she made no move to pick it up. Adele Duchamp stood behind Clara, arms folded, her brow furrowed in quiet defiance, and Clara herself sat at the piano, her hands poised just above the keys, waiting. They were waiting for a visitor. It was Miss Marple's idea, of course. And like all her plans, it was delivered in a tone of gentle suggestion, dressed in the trappings of routine. He will come, she had said to evenings prior. As they sat sipping tea in Adele's drawing room, Lachman, or whoever he calls himself, now he will come because he believes Clara is the key young, impressionable, recently bereaved. He will think she knows less than she does. But what if he suspects a trap? Adele had asked. He may. But I suspect his pride will be stronger than his caution. And so it was decided Clara would rehearse Morris's nocturne for the Fallen Bird at the usual hour on Thursday morning, windows open, as she often had in the weeks after his death. Adele would arrive for tea, and Miss Marple would just happen to drop in with a basket of scones. The bait would be quiet, respectful, and precisely arranged. The knock came at 23 minutes past 11. It was a delicate nocturne taps, a pause, and then a third, as if the caller was uncertain whether he was welcome or merely wished to appear so. Clara opened the door. He stood with a mild smile, a wool scarf wound neatly at his neck and a small parcel in one hand. He was older than Clara had expected, perhaps in his late 60s, with thinning silver hair and dark eyes set a little too close together. But it was his manner, more than his features, that set Miss Marple's instincts ringing. He did not glance at Adele or Miss Marple when he stepped inside. Instead, he moved straight toward the piano, as though drawn by something prearranged. I heard the music as I passed, he said, his voice smooth and tinged with a faint European lilt. It stopped me in my tracks. So rare to hear that piece in its full form. You play it well, Miss Sims. Clara offered a polite nod. Thank you. I'm Hugo Kramer, he said, placing the parcel thin, wrapped in brown paper on the side table. I used to know Maurice, years ago, in Vienna. Miss Marple said nothing. She watched his movements. How he scanned the room subtly, how his gaze lingered on the music stand, the shelves, the cabinet where Clara stored her practice journals. Was it long ago? Adele asked evenly. He looked at her then, his smile tightening. Ah, you must be his sister. You have his eyes. Adele didn't smile back. He never mentioned you. Kramer didn't flinch. He rarely spoke of Vienna, I imagine. Those years were complicated. He stepped forward, gesturing to the sheet music Clara had been rehearsing. Might I? He asked. Just a few bars. My fingers are not what they once were, but the melody stays in them. Clara hesitated, looking toward Miss Marple, the old woman. gave a mild nod. Kramer sat, adjusted the bench, and began to play. The first measures were halting, but then his hands settled into the rhythm. The phrasing was slightly off-note the way Maurice had played it, but Kramer's fingers moved with the familiarity of someone who had known the piece intimately. Too intimately, he stopped abruptly at the section Miss Marple had long since marked as unusual: the altered bars, the coded rhythm. His fingers lingered, then fell away. Such a haunting passage. He murmured, so unlike the rest, "Yes, Miss Marple," said, almost as though it hides something. Kramer looked up slowly. Music often does, and there it was, the first crack. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She reached down and retrieved her knitting needles, though she did not begin to use them. Maurice once said that memory can be played backwards, that in some pieces, when reversed, truths reveal themselves. Kramer tilted his head. Did he? I don't recall him being fond of riddles. Oh. I think he was, she said lightly, particularly when the truth was too dangerous to speak plainly. She let the silence stretch, then added, "Your playing is very distinctive, Mr. Kramer, but not particularly Viennese." Adele turned sharply. Miss Marple went on, her tone still polite, "Nor does your name appear in the Vienna Philharmonic archives, though Morris's journal mentioned a man who claimed it did." Kramer stood. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice still calm, "you seem to know a great deal for someone who claims to be merely an observer." "I've spent most of my life observing," she said. "And more importantly, remembering. For example, I remember the way Morris's notes referred to a man with a particular habit, his right eye squinting before the left when he smiled. A rather rare thing." Kramer's eyes hardened. Adele stepped forward, anger rising in her chest. "You were there, weren't you? In the shadows at the garden party. You watched him fall. You wanted to be sure the music died with him." Kramer didn't deny it. He merely picked up his parcel. "I came to recover something that does not belong in public hands." Maurice was not the only one who kept secrets. There are others still alive who deserve peace, and others, Miss Marple said, who deserve justice. For the first time, Kramer's face darkened. "There will be no justice if the world burns from old truths. You think publishing this music will help? It will only reawaken old wars." Miss Marple stood slowly, her hands clasped before her. "And yet," she said, "it was Morris's choice to hide the truth in harmony, not to destroy, but to preserve. If it had been your decision, you'd have burned the pages and the pianist alike." Kramer said nothing, his knuckles whitened around the parcel. Then the knock came, firm, authoritative. Miss Marple opened the door. Inspector Creighton stepped inside, followed by two constables. "Mr. Hugo Kramer," he said evenly. "You are wanted in connection with the investigation into the death of Maurice Duchamp and the suppression of wartime documents." Kramer didn't resist. He simply straightened his coat, gave one last look at the piano, and let them escort him out into the morning air. When the door closed, Clara let out a shaky breath. Adele crossed to the piano and laid a single hand on its lid. "It's over," she whispered. But Miss Marple shook her head. "No, my dear, the music has only just begun." She turned toward the fire, where the light flickered against the edges of the room. "Because some notes echo long after the final bar is played, and the world was about to hear the truth it had nearly forgotten." The early days of November settled over Little Wythorn like a soft shawl. The rain was gentle, the trees mostly bare, and the air carried the sharp, earthy scent of wood smoke and fading chrysanthemums. It was the kind of weather that made a village fold into itself, curtains drawn early, kettles kept warm, and the few remaining flowers bowed low with dew. Yet behind the closed doors and quiet routines, there lingered an unspoken tension, as though something unfinished still stirred beneath the surface. At Hawthorne Rise, Adele Duchamp stood in the music room, watching Clara Sims carefully align The score of Nocturne for the Fallen Bird on the stand, her hands no longer trembled, her fingers no longer hesitated. She had practiced the piece daily since Kramer's arrest. Not because Miss Marple had asked her to, and not because the constabulary required it, but because Maurice had once told her if my story is ever to be told, it must be through the music. Miss Marple, seated nearby with her ever-present knitting, looked up from her needles. "Shall we begin?" she said softly. Clara nodded. She sat, poised, and began to play. The first movement unfolded like a memory itself, which was soothing and sweet. Then came the second, darker and more urgent, and then, finally, the passage that had led them here, the coded bars, the strange rhythms, the bars that had concealed names, places, and in the end, the truth. As Clara reached the closing measures, the notes slowed and softened, like a voice fading into silence. No one spoke for a moment after she finished. Then Adele rose and opened a narrow folder she had kept locked in Maurice's cabinet. Inside were two letters. One was addressed to Adele, the other, surprisingly, to Miss Marple. She handed them over without a word. Miss Marple unfolded hers with care, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. "My dear Miss Marple, if this finds you, then you have already done more than I ever dared to ask. Thank you for seeing the truth I could no longer protect alone. There is one final piece to this alone you must help them understand. I did not die of poison, nor by accident. The man you now know as Hugo Kramer found his way to me earlier than I expected. He brought a vial with him, a mild cardiac agent designed to mimic a heart event. He gave me a choice: deliver the full score, or die in silence. I chose the silence, but only temporarily, because I knew you would listen. I knew you would hear what others did not. What remains must be published, not for vengeance, but for remembrance. The music is a record, not of bitterness, but of courage. With my deepest gratitude, Maurice Duchamp." Miss Marple folded the letter and looked at Adele, who now sat with her own copy, her eyes glassy. "He chose to leave," Adele whispered. "He knew it was coming, and he let it happen." Miss Marple reached for the tea tray and poured a cup for her. "He let it happen because he believed the truth would outlive him, and it has, but it still feels like surrender," Adele said. "No," Miss Marple said gently, "it feels like a sacrifice." The next week brought a quiet bustle to Little Wythorn. Inspectors came and went, collecting final evidence from Maurice's journal and letters. A music historian from London arrived, summoned by Adele to authenticate the original composition. And Miss Marple, in her own unobtrusive way, arranged for the truth to be passed along to the proper authorities, those who would know how to preserve it and when to share it. The final twist, however, came unexpectedly. It was a letter, forwarded from the French consulate, addressed to Adele Duchamp and postmarked from Geneva. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and the return address gave only initials. Inside was a single page. "To the sister of the man who carried our memories, I once walked with Maurice across a border lined with snow and silence. He saved many lives, mine included. He told me once that if he ever died under strange circumstances, the truth would be found by a woman who listened more than she spoke. I see now he was right. The other name, he feared Lockman, was not the worst of them, but he was the last. Your brother's music is the map to all we tried to protect. Play it, share it, let it echo. We are listening." The letter was signed Irina. Adele placed the page in a frame on the piano. Weeks passed. The leaves gave way to frost. In the village, the talk of the arrest faded into the background, absorbed once more by the quiet machinery of rural life parish meetings, winter soup drives, and Christmas choir rehearsals. But something had shifted. At St. Bed's Hall, a concert was held the first week of December. Not a grand affair, just the community gathered in scarves and mittens, sipping tea and listening to local musicians perform pieces of their choosing. The program was modest, but one listing drew curious attention: Nocturne for the Fallen Bird, performed by Clara Sims' original arrangement by Maurice Duchamp when Clara stepped onto the stage. There was a hush, then she began to play in. The audience sat Adele, her face composed but glowing with quiet pride, and at the back, near the door, Miss Marple listened with her hands folded neatly in her lap. The piece unfolded in all its aching intricacy. Each note, each shift in tempo, was no longer a mystery, but a message of sorrow, of hope, of resistance. It was not simply a performance, it was a revelation. And though only a handful in the room understood the full weight of what they heard, all felt something settle in their bones. When the final note faded, the audience did not applaud at once. They sat still, as if unwilling to break the spell. Then, as if moved by the breath of the music itself, they rose one by one. Clara bowed. Adele stood, and Miss Marple, ever quiet, ever unnoticed in the grander schemes, allowed herself a small smile. Outside, the frost had deepened, clinging to windows and cobblestones. But in the warm hush of the hall, something had been released. Not vengeance, not a scandal, but the truth. That night, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, lit a small lamp in her parlour, and made herself a cup of tea. She picked up her knitting, the scarf now near finished, and looked out at the moonlit garden. Human nature, she thought, was as layered as any melody, capable of great kindness and deep betrayal. Capable of sacrifice, and sometimes, when listened to closely, it told you everything you needed to know. She returned to her stitches, the rhythm familiar, the pattern clear. Outside, the village slept, but the music played on. -1 in Little Wythorn arrived with frost-tipped hedgerows and the comforting smell of coal smoke curling from chimneys. By the first Sunday of Advent, wreaths had appeared on doors. Church bells rang a little longer, and the village green twinkled with fairy lights hastily strung between lampposts. The events surrounding Maurice Duchamp's death had not been forgotten, but they had softened in the way memories are slipping beneath the rhythms of daily life. At Hawthorne Rise, the piano remained in its usual place, though it seemed somehow less burdened now, as if the truth it once held had been released from its strings. Adele Duchamp stood in the hallway that morning, fastening the clasp on her travelling coat. Her ticket to Paris was tucked in her handbag, along with a letter from the archives office at the Sorbonne, confirming her scheduled appointment with the curators of the Wartime Resistance Collection. She would not go to search for revenge or for fame. She would go because it was what Maurice had asked, because his music had spoken, and now she would do the rest. Clara Sims arrived just as the carriage from St. Bed's pulled into the lane. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, and she carried a small box wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "I thought you should have this before you leave," she said. Adele accepted the parcel and opened it delicately. Inside was a leather-bound folio, newly embossed in gold: Nocturne for the Fallen Bird, original composition, 1944 to 1970. Clara had painstakingly transcribed the full version, annotated every cipher, and included a dedication at the bottom in neat handwriting. For those who played in silence, and those who heard it, Adele's throat tightened. She embraced Clara without a word. Miss Marple arrived moments later. Dressed in her pale blue coat with a soft scarf around her neck, she carried a small, wrapped tin, a bit of seed cake. She said lightly, "For the train journey. It travels well." "Thank you," Adele said with a quiet smile. "You've done more than I can ever repay." "Nonsense," Miss Marple replied. "I simply listened. It was Maurice who spoke, through the music, and through you." They walked her to the gate together. The carriage driver tipped his cap, and Adele stepped inside. As the horses clattered off toward the station, the two women stood in the quiet lane, the frost crunching softly beneath their feet. Clara looked up at the sky, pale and wide above the rooftops. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked. Miss Marple turned to her, her expression as serene as ever. "Over, perhaps, for us, but history has a habit of continuing its melody, Clara, even after the audience believes the concert is done." Back in her own cottage, Miss Marple returned to her parlour and sat near the fire, knitting in her lap, though she made no move to begin. On the small table beside her was Morris's final letter, carefully folded, and beside it, the completed folio Clara had gifted Adele. She had thought often, in the quiet hours, about the decision Maurice had made to submit to silence in order to amplify a message only few would ever hear. There had been something deeply human in it, not heroic, not theatrical, but grounded in the patient understanding that sometimes a whisper, passed to the right ear, could do more than a scream. Later that week, the final piece fell into place. Inspector Creighton visited her with a folder in hand and an expression of reluctant respect. "You were right about Lachman," he said, placing the folder on her tea table. "His real name was Hans Carl Jurgens. We confirmed it through Interpol. Former intelligence officer, thought to have disappeared after 46, re-emerged in Argentina in the early 50s, changed identity, moved through Europe under 3 separate passports. The Duchamp case brought him back into the spotlight." Miss Marple poured tea into 2 cups and handed one to him. "He wasn't after vengeance," she said quietly. "Only erasure." Creighton took the cup. "Well, he won't be erasing anything now. He'll be standing trial likely not just here, but internationally. There's a great deal of interest in him." She sipped her tea and said nothing for a moment. Then she added, "I often wonder, Inspector, how many stories go untold because those who lived them lacked the means or the courage to preserve them." Creighton glanced toward the fire. "Too many, I'd wager. But not this one." He paused, then gave a sheepish sort of smile. "You're a difficult woman to keep ahead of, Miss Marple." "Not at all," she said kindly. "I just pay attention." That night, little Wythorn settled under a gentle flurry of snow. The village square stood still, its stone fountain laced with frost, its shop windows glowing faintly with tinsel and candlelight. From Miss Marple's parlour window, the world looked untouched by conflict or codes or secrets, and yet it was not the same village it had been at St. Bede's. The choir rehearsed for the Christmas pageant. Clara Sims had taken over the role of accompanist full-time, and her playing had developed a new gravity, still precise, still melodic, but with a weight that came from having walked through shadows and returned with song. Adele wrote once a week from Paris. Her letters spoke of names rediscovered, places verified, of secret notebooks uncovered in conservatories, and of long-lost recordings quietly preserved in dusty corners of French radio archives. One letter stood out. In particular, "I met a woman named Colette Moreau. She was Maurice's contact in Lyon during the occupation. She hadn't heard his name in decades. But when I played a section of the nocturne for her, just a few bars, wept, not because it was sad, but because she said it sounded exactly like a road she once walked in winter, when silence was the safest song." Miss Marple read that letter by lamplight, with a shawl around her shoulders and a ginger cut curled at her feet. She did not cry. But she did place the letter in the same drawer where she kept her collection of pressed flowers and her brother's old war medals. By Christmas Eve, the village had resumed its routines entirely. The past no longer hovered quite so close, and the music that once whispered of danger now belonged to remembrance. On Christmas morning, after the service at St. Bede's and the exchange of modest gifts, Miss Marple returned home and sat at her writing desk. She took up her pen and began a new letter to her nephew Raymond. "My dear Raymond, I expect you We'll hear of the Duchamp affair soon, though perhaps not all the details. You've always told me my stories strain belief, and this one may be no different, but I will tell you this much: the truth, like a melody, is rarely obvious. Sometimes it repeats itself until someone finally listens, and sometimes it hides between the notes, waiting for the right ear to hear it. Your loving aunt, Jane. She sealed the letter and placed it by the door. Outside, snow began to fall again softly, without sound. Inside, Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more. The scarf was finished, but life, like music, was always ready to begin another piece. January arrived in Little Wythorn with little fanfare. There were no fireworks, no grand resolutions, only the muffled hush of frost-covered rooftops and chimneys exhaling white trails into the slate-grey sky. Time, in its quiet English way, resumed its course, as if the winter weeks that followed Maurice Duchamp's death had been nothing more than a strange and distant dream. But in the hearts of those who had heard the music and understood its message, something had changed. At Hawthorne Rise, the curtains remain open now. Adele Duchamp had not returned from Paris yet, but she had written often, and her letters were pinned to the kitchen notice board in Clara Sims's cottage. They arrived with increasing optimism. She had met historians, curators, even a former resistance fighter who had recognized Morris's signature embedded within the nocturne's unusual second movement. The coded music had become more than a curiosity. It had become a living document of resistance and a tribute to courage. Plans were underway to archive the full composition with the National Museum of War Music in Paris. Back in Little Wythorn, the talk of spies, ciphers, and mystery had ebbed. Mr. Petherick, the retired solicitor, once again held forth in the tea room about the importance of preserving parish records, and Mrs. Pruitt had returned to her campaign for replanting the tulip beds by the church. Gossip had not disappeared entirely. Nothing ever did, but the village, as villages do, preferred the comfort of forgetting, except Miss Marple. Miss Marple remembered everything. One Monday morning, Clara paid a visit to Miss Marple's cottage. She arrived with a tin of cinnamon biscuits and a shy smile, her cheeks red from the wind. "I found something," she said, stepping into the warm parlour. "Something I think Maurice left behind deliberately. I didn't notice it until I started going through the practice copy he gave me months ago of the simplified arrangement, but he marked the bars slightly differently than in the original. At first, I thought it was just for emphasis." Miss Marple motioned for her to sit. "Show me, my dear." Clara opened the folio and pointed to 3 penciled notations, small crosses, each one precisely placed at the first note of 3 separate staves. "They form a pattern," she said. "E, G, D." Miss Marple looked over her spectacles. "Letters again. I looked them up in Morris's cipher. It spells E.G. and I remembered that was the catalogue code he once mentioned. He said it belonged to a book in his old conservatory library in London, a volume of forgotten chamber pieces." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "A book," she said, "where a message may still be waiting." Clara leaned forward. "Do you think he left more?" Miss Marple's expression softened. "I think Maurice understood that music is memory, and like memory, it echoes. It changes shape with time, but it never truly disappears. If he left something else, we'll hear it eventually." They shared the biscuits over a quiet hour of conversation and tea, the fire crackling gently in the hearth. Outside, the trees stood bare and still, their branches dark against the white sky. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage to speak with Reverend Caldwell. She found him in the small chapel garden, scattering seed for the birds. "I thought I might return this," she said, holding out a well-read hymnal. "You lent it to me months ago for the All Saints recital. I believe I've finally remembered too." "Bring it back." "Ah yes," he said with a smile. Well, I'm glad to have it. You know, I've been thinking of adding a musical segment to our Lenten reflections this year, perhaps something contemplative. Miss Marple nodded. I believe we could all benefit from quiet reflection. They walked together for a moment, the silence companionable. And how is Adele? The vicar asked gently. Stronger than I've seen her, Miss Marple said, and more at peace. He paused at the gate. It was a terrible thing. What happened to her brother? Yes, Miss Marple agreed. And yet through it, so much good has come to light, not just about Maurice, but about others, forgotten people. Hidden stories, it is a strange thing, Reverend. How the truth finds its way out whether in words or in music. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. And you, Miss Marple, are you at peace? She gave a soft smile, as much as one ever is. But peace, I think, is not the absence of disturbance, it is the presence of understanding. That night, Miss Marple returned home and began sorting through her notes. She had kept a modest folder titled Duchamp since the beginning, filled with clippings, letters, coded pages, and her own thoughts scribbled in tidy handwriting. She did not intend to publish them or hand them to any authority, but she would keep them because someday someone else might come looking, and if they listened closely, she wanted them to find the whole tune, not just the refrain, by early February. The village had well and truly moved on. The market stalls bustled again with chatter and muddy boots, and Miss Hetty Gudgeon at the post office was already planning her spring bonnet entry for the Easter fete. Then came Adele's final letter before her return. Dearest Jane, I write. From the steps of the Palais Garnier, I have just left the rehearsal for the winter programme. Morris's Nocturne will be performed next month here, in full. The conductor has insisted on preserving the original arrangement, including the coded second movement. They've added a note in the programme this piece was once played in silence. Now it plays so that others may speak. I think Maurice would have smiled at that. You are right, music is memory. And when it's shared, it becomes something more, of a testimony. Thank you for helping me hear what he was trying to say. With love, Adele. Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, the letter resting in her hand. Through the window, she watched a robin hopping along the garden wall, a small red bloom against the grey. The silence in the room was complete, but far from empty. She rose and crossed to her phonograph. From a small box she drew a record of the rehearsal press Clara had made after her last performance. She placed it gently on the turntable and set the needle. The opening notes of Nocturne for the Fallen Bird floated through the parlour, familiar now, but never dulled by repetition. The composition was no longer simply a lament, it had become a witness. And Miss Marple, ever the listener, let it play. When it ended, she removed the record, returned it to its sleeve, and smiled. The story was finished. Not because there was nothing more to uncover, but because the music had spoken all it needed to say. Outside, the village hummed quietly, and inside, Miss Marple resumed her knitting. Because even when the mysteries are solved, life continues. Row by row, note by note, and someone must always listen.